If you aren't old enough to have been like an adult plugged in Vikings fan by like 1994, 1995, you might not know who John Michels is, but you really, really, really should. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I am your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL. You can find the show on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. So, I want to start this story off somewhere around the late 60s, early 70s. There's a kid who is getting bullied in school, as is wont to happen in school. And this kid finally goes and stands up to his bullies, comes to a big fight. Everybody gets in trouble. Teachers get involved. Parents get called. This kid's parents are unreachable for whatever reason at the time, so they have to go bring in a friend to go pick him up from school. So this friend comes into the principal's office or whatever, and he says all the right things in the, we'll discipline him. You shouldn't do that. Don't get into fights. There's better ways to, says all the right things and says, all right, teach, we'll take it from here. We'll make sure he gets his discipline, right? And they get in the car and he looks at the kid, and instead of being angry or, being disciplinarian or anything like that, he just says, get any good ones in on him? That was John Michels, and the kid was Mike Grant, Bud Grant's son. There's two things about John Michels that you can learn from this story, and they're two very important things. For one, he is absolutely the guy you trust to go pick up your kid from school if he's in trouble. He is the kind of person in many families of the people that he worked with across his career that became part of your family almost, and you became part of his, and the bonds just ran so deep with everybody. So many lives touched. And two, competition was everything to John Michels. It was a moral issue for him. Competition wasn't just a thing you use to iron sharpen iron. No. Competition and being competitive and taking competition seriously was his identity. He was competition incarnate. John Michels, if you don't know, was the O-line coach for the Vikings for over 20 years, 67 all the way through 1993. He only had 1 year there where he wasn't the O-line coach. He was the running backs coach for the weird Les Steckel year. We don't have to talk about it, why that happened. But otherwise, he was the O-line coach all the way up until he retired in 93. So that was the whole Bud Grant era. And then Jerry Burns kept him in the job, and then Denny Green kept him in the job when Denny Green took over for as long as he was willing to coach. Before that, John Michels was a standout lineman himself in college. He's in the College Football Hall of Fame as a Tennessee Volunteer, and he played 1 year in Philadelphia. When he came back to coach, that is where he linked up with Bud Grant. Bud Grant actually played on the Philadelphia Eagles for a couple of years right before John Michels played for the Philadelphia Eagles back in the 50s. So they narrowly missed each other as players, but they had that shared experience and they had shared military experience. So they bonded, they had a lot in common and they saw eye to eye, and the two became lifelong close friends. So when Bud Grant took the Vikings job in 1967, he brings John Michels with him, and that is where John Michels worked for the next, what would that be, 25, 26 years? Casually position coach for a quarter century in the NFL. This is a thing that happens all the time. And that's the bare bones, though. That's what you can look up about John Michels on his Wikipedia page, which is not very long, and it should be longer. His reputation very much precedes him. Randall McDaniel tells a story. Randall McDaniel was drafted in 1988. And by then, he knew about John Michels. I mean, everybody in the world of football knew, oh, yeah, the Vikings O-line coach, he's a big deal. And Randall McDaniel, first-round draft pick, mind you, eventual Hall of Famer, was oh, man, I don't know if this dude wants me here. I think I might be good as gone. Now, obviously, this didn't happen, right? Randy McDaniel had a very long and fruitful career with the Vikings. But that's the reputation of John Michels. And look, the Vikings have a rich history of offensive linemen in their past. In their like more recent past, you have guys like Steve Hutchinson and Matt Burke and stuff. But go all the way back. You have Todd Stussy, Tim Irwin. Stussy, I don't know if Stussy was there when Michels was there. He might have been a later guy, but Tim Irwin was there, of course. And he was a left tackle for, I want to say, like 13 years. He made John Michels the godfather of his children. And then, just to name the Hall of Famers, Mick Tingelhoff, Ron Yeri, Gary Zimmerman, and then Randall McDaniel. That's just the Hall of Famers. Add in that Ed White and Grady Alderman. It was quite a resume for John Michels. And how you get to create that much. I mean, look, you coach in the league for 25 years. Some very, very talented dudes are going to come across. Like Zimmerman and Ron Yeri were insanely, insanely talented guys. And some of those guys like Alderman and Mick Tingelhoff were very much like well established by the time Grant and Michels got there in '67. But then, you have other guys that weren't as big and strong and powerful that still made for really, really good offensive line units. The Vikings kind of always had a good O-line up until, this recent stretch where they, it's been like a decade where they haven't had one. Kind of new for their history, though. Like if you zoom all the way out, all the way to their, what's it now, like 62, 63 year history, you can see that like they had elite O-lines kind of up until right now, and then this problem they haven't been able to solve, but it was always there. So I want to talk to you, though, not about John Michels' resume, not about like, oh, here's the Hall of Famers and here's what you would find on the museum exhibit, but I want to talk to you more about how he was as a person and how he forged those relationships. I think that's the story that's worth telling. But before I get into any of that, let me talk to you about a good old Gramble. At betonline.net, you can find all sorts of things to gamble on if you are just craving. Look, it is a deep, dark part of the offseason. Maybe you're a little thirsty. Go lay down a gamble. Live a little. You can bet on week 1. You can bet on final record over under 8.5 wins. Will the Vikings make the playoffs? Will they win the division? If they won't, where will they finish? If you think they'll get second place in the division, you can bet on that. And I'm pretty sure it's like plus 200 some last I checked. So it's like not even like favorite odds just because it's, one of 4 options. You can maybe go make I think that's a plus value bet. You can find all that stuff at BetOnline, or you can bet on hockey or women's basketball or tennis or golf or MMA, whatever. Go to betonline.net, bet on player props individually, build wacky parlays, bet in the middle of a game with their live betting apparatus. One more time, that is betonline.net, where the game starts. If ever you were to walk on a team plane in the 70s or any time in the Bud Grant era, you would find in the back of the plane John Michels losing games of gin rummy to Bud Grant. The reason for the Bud Grant loved playing cards against John Michels because Michels was so fiery and competitive that he had absolutely no poker face to speak of. And so he's like, yeah, playing cards against him was great. But isn't that kind of perfect for a guy where competition is his whole thing? He was just a fiery competitor. Randall McDaniel tells one story. This was somewhere in the early 90s. It would have been like 92, 93, one of the last years of John Michels. So this is like an older guy, keep in mind. And the D-line coach at the time, it's O-line, D-line one-on-ones, and the D-line coach at the time, he's talking to his players, and he makes some comment about, like, that lineman can't block or whatever, and John Michels hears this, and it's not the players going and saying, like, hey, don't talk about our guys. And, of course, O-line is such as, like, a cohesive thing. They all stick together. And it's John Michels who's, like, ready to get in a fight with the D-line. You got the coaches fighting each other. The players, like, having to break them up, I would assume. But, like, that's what you get. He always had your back. He was so good at that, at forging that bond. O-line is such a weird thing. It's a weird dynamic, like, from a purely, like, interpersonal perspective, where you have, at 9, 10 people on an active roster, make it 13, 15 people on a camp roster. Individuals, different people from different backgrounds, different walks of life, different likes and dislikes and personalities and ways of handling conflict that all have to kind of come together and become a hive mind. And the way to do that, the way John Michels did it, I think the way good O-line coaches do that is truly by saying, like, my bond with you and you all have a bond with me, and that's what you have in common. And, we are a unit and I am your field general. And being able to forge that bond with so many different people, and like that is not a skill that you learn. That's not a skill that you like come up with. It's not something you can read a book on and understand, right? And I think the best O-line coaches have that. It's not the ones that are the best run game coordinators or the ones that understand the most about like specific techniques and stuff. No, it's the people who can forge a bond with their players, and like thick and thin, people that you're going to know and understand for life. I think that's something that can only come from a truly organic place, from a place of somebody who just genuinely and deeply cares about the success of the person standing in front of him on the field. And that's what everybody says about John Michels. That's what everybody talks about. It's the authenticity of it. Not just that this guy, oh yeah, this guy, like Gary Zimmerman tells a story about this drill we used to do, and he's bone spurs in his elbows from his playing days, and it reminds him of this drill where he would have his hand tied behind his back, and it was supposed to teach you how to like one hand, two hand your punch, so you weren't punching all at the same time. You're supposed to stagger it. And he just like thinks about those drills. That's all well and good, but really what stuck with players, what stuck with people in his life was, man, that guy really cared about you. Like he didn't want you to think he cared about you. He didn't have the appearance of caring about you. He genuinely just couldn't help but care if the guy across from him needs to become better through all of this. And competition was kind of the way he liked to do that. And of course, it's perfect for the NFL. But doing that, making people into a cohesive unit that all has each other's backs and works together, and, that hive mind without losing their individuality is something I think you can only do with a genuine care for the person that you're working with. Dennis Swilley, who took over for Mick Tingelhoff after Tingelhoff retired, so he was center throughout a lot of like the 80s. He talks about how you'd say, "Hi, coach," and with whatever he would match your tone, and he would say, "Hi, player," and it's like just this funny thing you would do to be like, "Come on, we're all people with names. We're all people, we're all individuals," and that melding. There's something so beautiful about it, with O-line, that melding of the individual becoming a collective, but not losing that individuality. If you can straddle that line, you generate a whole lot of great and elite O-lines. I find myself repeating a line that I think about a lot, that sports are kind of one of the only true places in all of our modern society where somebody can realize the like truest, purest, unadulterated form of themselves. You're challenged and you're encouraged to be the most you that there is. Michels believed this. John Michels and Bud Grant used to, when they were like interviewing somebody to be on the staff or even for players and stuff, they would use racquetball as a metric, and they would hit the ball at these guys over and over and over. It's like, once you've been pelted by a racquetball 20 times, how do you respond? There is no hiding your true personality. If you are a person with a temper, that temper's coming out. If you are a person without a temper, if you're a very forgiving person, that's going to show, There's no more hiding yourself. It's one of the great beauties of sports. It's one of the values of sports, that on a football field or a basketball court or a tennis court or whatever, you are the most you that you can be, and bringing that person out, nurturing that person. That's the coach's job. The coach's job is to make it so that the most you that you can be is the actualized and realized version of your best possible self. That's what coaching is. But it's also building that sense of family. One Thanksgiving, I think it was 1967, the first year, they were talking about what everybody's doing for Thanksgiving, and on the Vikings, a bunch of young single dudes that didn't have anywhere to go. So John Michels calls up his wife and is like, "Hey, got a bunch of hungry boys. Can they come over?" She's like, "Yeah, sure, of course. Happy Thanksgiving. Let's all come over." And then that became a tradition for years and years and years and years. Was if you were close enough to John Michels, you got to come over for Thanksgiving, and Thanksgivings at the Michels household became like this long-standing Vikings tradition. You were part of the family. You were family, and not in that like super poisoned way that like the place you work will be like, we're a family, and by the way, we're cutting your health insurance. Like, no, not that kind of weird thing, but like genuinely, he saw you as somebody he would stick up for like a son and nurture like a son and mentor like a son and challenge like a son and love like a son. There is no faking that. There is no, you can't be insincere about that. And, everybody talks about how much integrity he had and how much authenticity he had, and they don't need to point it out. You're a person like that, there's just no faking it. But that's not to overlook the actual like football impact that John Michels had. I mean, you don't have 4 Hall of Famers come through your tenure and a gajillion Pro Bowlers behind it. You don't have all that happen without actually knowing what the hell you're doing in terms of like teaching guys, and being a teacher and mentor and all that stuff. There was Chuck Foreman told some stories. A lot of these stories I'm getting from a write-up of John Michels's memorial service, which happened when Michels passed away in 2019. Old, happy, surrounded by friends and family, taken very well care of through his final years, which makes me happy. He deserves that. But those O-lines under John Michels were always smart. There was a lot of like emphasis on, study your film, know what they're looking at. And, you look back at the old guys that were veterans when John Michels started, and they were guys that really valued this. Tingelhoff and Alderman specifically. Grady Alderman was a lot like Tingelhoff. Both those guys were undersized for their position. Even for back in the day when guys were a lot smaller, these guys were small for that. And so there was a lot of study the guy you're going to go up against all day. And they back in the day, it was very much there was like a left pass rusher and a right pass rusher. So when you're the left tackle, you're looking at, you know who you're going to get all day, and you can go watch all the film on them and say, okay, this is how they play and this is how I beat them. And that's sort of how Grady Alderman played. And he was the Vikings left tackle. He was an original Viking, and he was the Vikings left tackle till I want to say like 74. So he was really like as much a part of all of that Vikings dynasty and everything as Jim Marshall was, right? And often those two were the ones going up against each other in practice. I digress. That sort of film study was a big emphasis. And, you go all the way to the 80s and ask Gary Zimmerman and say, yeah, I had like a crap ton of right guards come through because we just had a big, like, kind of carousel of right guards all the time. And it was always a changing dude. And every single one of those people knew what they were going up against, knew how to block for that, knew the scheme, knew all that stuff. And it was all a very high intellect world. And that, too, is John Michels' impact. But it's also breeding a lot of toughness, pelting you with racquetballs and stuff and working you really hard in kind of a way that, like, doesn't really fly anymore. That's not to say he was one of those, like, total dictators that made football unfun or unenjoyable to play. And there was a lot of positive reinforcement, too. And that's another one of those things that's kind of hard to explain and hard to get the point across. But once you get it, you get it. He was very proud of his work, and not in a way that you talk about you're proud of how you do accounting. And I'm proud of my work. It's like, sure you are, Dave from Spokane, Washington. But in a genuine, like, beaming sense, he was proud of his players, and he was proud when you got better, and he was proud when you played well, and he let you know that he was proud of you. Not good job, but like, no, I am proud of you. And that's, I don't know, that's something, you hear that from an authority figure, and it hits a little different, and being able to take that pride and then teach you to take that pride in your work. It is one thing to go into a job interview and say, I, of course, take pride in my work, but to actually take pride in your work, and this is something I can say from at least a little personal experience, the work that I take pride in, work like this show, sometimes, work like sometimes the articles that I write, some of the other things I've done in my life, 100 times better than work that I just did to get a paycheck. And teaching you to have that pride in your work it's just another one of those things. It's not a skill you learn. It's not something you pick up from a book. It's not something you get in coaching school. It's just there's a kind of person that you have to be, that heart on your sleeve, integrity, We're all going to work our asses off and we're going to be proud of what we become and it's going to be worth it. And just having that knowledge, knowing that, makes him a special coach. I could sit here all day and tell you anecdotes from John Michels. I'll link the article that I sourced a lot of this from in the show notes, so you can read it for yourself and learn stuff. It's worth your time if you didn't learn it before. It's from Craig Peters, senior editor of Vikings.com. And look, he's an O-line coach. This is not a guy that's going to get a lot of press. This is not a guy that's going to be in the Hall of Fame or whatever. He's got to be in the Ring of Honor. This is my pitch. This is where I'm going to end with this here. This is officially my lobby to put John Michels in the Vikings Ring of Honor. Right now, there is only one staff member that is in the Ring of Honor that is not a head coach, and that's Fred Zamberletti, which, hell yeah, absolutely love that. But if there is any other singular person who was not at some point head coach of the Vikings, who had an impact of the Vikings on that staff, it is John Michels. It is a tradition that lasted well beyond his time here, and it's somebody that just deserves that recognition, even posthumously. He deserves that recognition. Next week, I have no idea what sort of nonsense we'll get into. We'll come up with something, but I'll see you then. Probably more history stuff. Maybe I'll start taking on some modern things, maybe do some storytime series stuff like what I've done in previous years. I'll start talking about some of the new players and telling you stories and stuff you might want to know about them, sort of in the same vein that I did this one. But in the meantime, you can, of course, find Locked On Vikings wherever you find your favorite shows. Go check out Locked On Timberwolves. The NBA draft was on Thursday, and Locked On Timberwolves was live. Ben Breakin doing a great job over there. So go check out Locked On Timberwolves, or if you're not a Wolves fan, whatever your favorite NBA team is, check out Locked On that. You can find it wherever you find this show. So go do that. I will see you all Monday. And as always, Skol.